thank you for inviting me back to participate in the Humanities Center Brown Bag talk. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to share my research, but also what really is kind of kicking the pants to sit down at the computer and work through materials that I acquired during a week that I spent down in Durham at Duke University this past summer. I'd also like to thank particularly Dina, who put together the flyer and made sure that this PowerPoint was up. Great assistance on that part. One final sort of opening. My father always jokes that my research on the Meiji period deals with all of the vices in which I do not myself participate. And since I moved from anti-drinking and anti-prostitution, anti-concubinage, now I'm looking at the tobacco industry. The anti-smoking part is one chapter of this larger book project on King tobacco in Meiji Japan. As Walter said, and as the title of today's talk indicates, I'm focusing in particular on one episode in the history of the Japanese tobacco industry in the late Meiji period, so really around the turn of the century into the early 20th century, which is an engagement between the American Tobacco Company and Mirai Brothers. And without further ado, I will begin. In 1899, James Duke of the American Tobacco Company entered into a joint venture with Mirai Brothers, one of Japan's largest cigarette manufacturers, to make American tobacco and Mirai brands in Japan. This move was part of Duke's larger strategy to expand his business into Asia and to circumvent the efforts of the Meiji government to insulate and protect native businesses from foreign competition, as well as to ensure that profits remained in country. Duke's choice of man to ensure the advancement of American tobacco interests in Japan was Edward James Parrish. Because the company files of Mirai and many other private cigarette manufacturers from the Meiji period were not preserved, Parrish's own meticulously kept letters of his business dealings shed invaluable light on both Mirai Brothers and the tobacco industry writ large during the late Meiji period. Among other topics, Parrish's letters addressed daily operating procedures, expansion plans, advertising strategies, ebbs and flows in cigarette purchases, enticements to jobbers, who were the retailers, actually the sellers on the street of cigarettes, to hawk one brand over another, legal maneuvers against imitators, and negotiations over state compensation to private firms when the tobacco industry was nationalized in 1904. Using in part Parrish's letters, I would like to discuss today the setting for and founding of Mirai Brothers and Company Limited, the joint venture, and highlight briefly some of the challenges that Parrish faced and the successes that he won. As I will argue later, those very successes ultimately contributed to the Meiji state's decision to shutter all private cigarette firms. So while Parrish did his job and made money for American tobacco, he also played a role in its eventual forced departure from the Japanese market. To begin, let me briefly introduce Parrish himself, since he's front and center in the title of the talk, and was the key man for American tobacco in Japan. Born in 1846 in what is now Durham County in North Carolina to a future city mayor, Parrish attended local schools and was pursuing advanced studies at Trinity College when the Reserve Act resulted in his being called up at the age of 18 to serve the Confederacy. He was assigned to a company in the 4th North Carolina Cavalry, and although he saw action only during the last half year of the Civil War, those were deadly months for his unit. Only 4 or 5 in his group survived to fight at Appomattox. After the war, Parrish returned to the family farm to help revive its fortunes before relocating to Raleigh to try his hand as a salesman for a dry goods store. His natural curiosity and kindly manners contributed greatly to the success that he enjoyed and won for him both influential friends and a wife. In the early 1870s, Parrish moved back to Durham, where he operated his own grocery and confectionery store, while supplementing his income working twice a week as a tobacco auctioneer. His prowess at hawking tobacco convinced him to go into the tobacco selling business full time. The first day he operated out of a rented warehouse proved him right. He sold 80,000 pounds of gold leaf for $15,000, which was considered at that point an excellent day's business. Thanks to his own indomitable energy, Parrish did a thriving business, successful enough that he was able to build his own warehouse and relocate. This new building officially opened in 1879, had over 200,000 square feet of floor space, held stalls for 2,000 horses, and could accommodate 5,000 people sitting in chairs. On occasion, those chairs were occupied not by bidders, but by churchgoers attending rivals. Parrish himself was a good old Methodist. Contributors to fundraisers for the local fire department, and members of the Durham Light Infantry, of which Parrish himself was the captain. Parrish made notable use of the extra space, and the 3 years from 1881 to 1883 saw him sell over 20 million pounds of tobacco for a total of $2.5 million. Using the profits made, Parrish ventured into tobacco manufacturing in 1886 when he acquired all of the assets of the Lion Company, inclusive of a brick building that made smoking tobacco and several kinds of cigarettes, including the Pride of Durham. Just 1 month later, Parrish's fortunes took a sudden turn for the worse when fire destroyed his warehouse. His personal losses totaled approximately $35,000, and he was able to stay in the tobacco business and eventually rebuild the warehouse, largely because this newly acquired manufacturing facility escaped damage and he was able to continue operations there. The 1888 Durham financial crisis, however, compounded Parrish's troubles and left his bank ready to call in his loans. The bank management was convinced otherwise when several friends and acquaintances provided a $10,000 guarantee for Parrish. He eventually was forced to sell his company and at considerable loss. Though the company's assets had exceeded its debt by just over $100,000 when the financial crisis hit, devaluation was immediate and severe, and Parrish found himself owing $30,000 after the sale. To try to offset his straitened circumstances, in 1897, he took up employment as a tobacco leaf buyer at a salary of $6,000 a year. And then in 1899, he accepted James Duke's offer to be American Tobacco's man at Murai Brothers and Company Limited. The promise of earning $15,000 a year in Japan may just have sealed the deal, and Parrish took full advantage of that windfall. His habit of allocating half of his monthly earnings, or his monthly pay, to pay off his debt enabled him to return to Durham in 1904 without owing a cent. When Parrish arrived in Japan in December 1899, the American Tobacco Company was almost a decade old, and it had already established itself as the most dominant single importer of cigarettes. According to a statistical survey of Japan's foreign trade and Parrish's own notes, Japan imported 235 million cigarettes in 1896, of which 77% were American tobacco products. 2 years later, American Tobacco claimed a 58% share of the import market, which had more than tripled in the meantime. To put it another way, American Tobacco went from importing just over 180 million cigarettes in 1896 to over 420 million cigarettes in 1898. Some of this expansion resulted from the tenacious efforts of J.W. Lee, American Tobacco's representative in Japan, to entice Japanese distributors to sell Pinhead, Cameo, and Old Gold. Let me come back to all I have. Here we go. Steady increases in per capita disposable income, combined with the Japanese taste for tobacco products, contributed as well. Equally important was the relatively small customs duty of 5% that the Japanese government imposed on imported tobacco. In the last decades of the 19th century, the Meiji government was slow to take full advantage of the potential revenue to be gained from the tobacco industry. In 1876, as part of a large-scale effort to revise the existing tax system, the state passed the Tobacco Regulations Tax Law, its first foray into taxing tobacco. This particular law established two different kinds of taxes: a flat annual tax of 10 yen on wholesalers and 5 yen on retailers, akin to a license to do business. This law also included a revenue stamp tax. Now, the revenue stamp tax imposed a sales tax of 2 to 7.5%, depending upon the grade of tobacco, and required retailers to buy revenue stamps and attach them to cigarette packs and cartons before selling the goods to customers. The government projected that these two taxes would bring into the state coffers approximately 550,000 yen a year. While the tax on wholesalers and retailers proved effective, the revenue stamp tax did not, and yielded only about 10% of the amount expected in 1876. Leaving the task of affixing the revenue stamp to retailers made tax evasion simply too easy. Conflict with China over influence in Korea and the need to expand Japan's military capabilities prompted the Meiji government to tweak the tobacco tax law in 1883. That year, the business tax on wholesalers was raised from 10 to 15 yen, while the revenue stamp tax saw a more serious revision. Specifically, the sales tax was increased to 12 to 24%. 3 different grades of tobacco were established based on price and weight, and the task of attaching the revenue stamps was shifted to manufacturers, who were also required to mark the stamps with their company seal. This last revision made tax evasion much more difficult, but not impossible. Cut tobacco was usually bound by string, and when the revenue stamp was attached to this binding, the stamp and binding could easily be removed before a sale, and the stamp then reused. Also, the state allowed individuals to grow tobacco for personal use, and this product often found its way into the market tax-free. That said, the 1883 revision significantly increased the state's tax revenue. That year, between the business and revenue stamp taxes, the government netted just shy of 2 million yen. 5 years later, in 1888, the state again revised tobacco taxes to fix the revenue stamp at 20%, regardless of grade, and to require that the stamps be firmly affixed with glue. These last revisions, and growth in the cigarette industry in particular, benefited the government to the tune of 3 million yen in 1896. That amount represented only about 2% of the state's revenue. Ever eager to make more out of the flourishing tobacco industry and in dire need of funds to recoup expenses associated with the Sino-Japanese War, the government established a monopoly on the sale of leaf tobacco in early 1898. The initial outlay of capital required to set up sites where leaves could be inspected and stored, as well as to train personnel, was high, but the difference between the prices at which the government purchased and then resold tobacco leaf was huge. Indeed, the government enjoyed an initial revenue rate of 183.5%. By 1902, that rate had been increased to 240 to 280%, depending upon the grade, with the higher rates then applied to the more popular lower grades of tobacco. While the creation of a state monopoly on the sale of tobacco leaves did not directly affect American tobacco interests in Japan, revision of custom duties in 1899 did. Roughly 40 years earlier, the Tokugawa shogunate had been forced via gunboat diplomacy to sign a collection of unequal treaties with the United States, Britain, the Netherlands, France, and Russia. These unequal treaties granted to the foreign signatories the right of extraterritoriality, stipulated the opening of treaty ports, and set tariff rates on imports and exports, with the rates themselves pegged to treaties and highly disadvantageous to Japan. Following the shogunate's overthrow in 1868, leaders of the new Meiji state prioritized revision of the unequal treaties and strategically implemented a host of political, military, legal, economic, and social reforms intended to establish Japan as an equal on the world stage. These efforts failed to impress in the short term, and it took Japanese diplomats until 1894 to win agreement from Britain for abrogation of the unequal clauses. That Anglo-Japanese Treaty of Commerce and Navigation did not go into effect until 1899, and Japan did not regain full tariff autonomy until 1911. Nonetheless, the other foreign signatories followed the British lead, and Japan was quick to act on the first of its restored sovereign rights, including the ability to set some of its own customs duties. Duties on imported cigarettes were among the first the Japanese government raised, and the year 1899 saw 2 rate hikes. The first increased the duty from 5 to 40%, and the second from 40 to 100%. In the face of this direct hit to its sales in Japan, American Tobacco could have folded up shop, but that option did not fit with James Duke's plan to make Pinhead, Cameo, and old cigarettes. Cigarettes people smoked around the world. Indeed, in 1894 and 1895, Duke had orchestrated the acquisition or merger acquisition of or merger with 9 tobacco companies in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And Asia loomed quite large as his next target. By 1899, he had already invested enough money in developing a distribution and sales network in Japan that he was unwilling to leave the market. To stay in Japan, Duke then had basically 3 options if he wished to avoid the steep customs duties on cigarettes. He could allocate the resources necessary to build his own manufacturing facility, he could buy out an existing Japanese enterprise, or he could merge with one. Duke opted for that 3rd option. Deciding which tobacco interest to invest in directly posed the next challenge, and the landscape was crowded, to say the least. In the United States, the late 19th century had seen significant consolidation as fierce competition had forced some businesses to shutter their factory and warehouse doors. And Duke had also engineered a series of vertical and horizontal mergers, and those maneuvers, together with outright acquisitions, had enabled him to create a tobacco trust. According to reports produced by Japan's Tobacco Monopoly Bureau, established in late 1898 to oversee the government's new monopoly on leaf tobacco, just shy of 7,000 individuals had licenses to manufacture tobacco products in Japan in 1899. That number is slightly deceptive. To explain, those same reports claimed that 4,700 tobacco manufacturing licenses had been sold for 1902, while a survey of tobacco factories listed only 363 in operation, also for 1902. You have a difference between 4,700 with licenses to build and yet then only 363 factories. The drastic difference in numbers stems from 2 basic facts. 1, not all with licenses actually manufactured tobacco products. And 2, the factory survey counted only those factories employing 10 or more workers. As the gap between the number of manufacturing licenses and operating factories highlights, the Japanese tobacco industry was peppered with small concerns. But 4 of the 363 factories listed in the 1902 survey had over 500 employees, and the vast majority had only 10 to 49 workers on payroll. Because the rolling of cigarettes, either plain or mouthpiece, did not require machinery, did not necessarily involve heavy capital investment, and could be done at home, an unknown number of small manufacturers operated with fewer than 10 workers. What is certain is that of the 363 tobacco factories with 10 or more employees, just 38 manufactured cigarettes. Moreover, of the 16,000 plus workers employed at those factories in 1902, about 36% were on the payroll of one of only 3 companies. Those 3 included Mirai Brothers, Iwaya Shokai, and Chiba Shoten. Duke set his sights on Mirai Brothers. Among the factors that influenced his decision were the character and business acumen of each company's founder. According to Parrish, Iwaya Matsuhei was a, and I quote here, rough, brave man without common sense. While Chiba Matsubei was, again quote, an honest, gentle man, but one doing a showy business. As for Mirai Kichibei, Parrish judged him to be a brave businessman. Granted, Parrish shared these assessments after Duke had already invested in Mirai Brothers, and he himself had moved to Japan. Regardless, the quality of management did factor into Duke's decision-making regarding expansion. The fact that Mirai was also the best known of the 3 founders among the American tobacco establishment probably contributed to Duke's decision as well. Whereas Iwaya and Chiba used Japanese-grown tobacco for their products, and thus had few connections outside of Japan, Mirai had differentiated himself in the competitive cigarette market by using tobacco leaves imported from Virginia and North Carolina. Those same imports and visits by Mirai and officers in his company to tobacco facilities around the Atlantic coast, beginning in 1893, helped to put Mirai Brothers on Duke's radar. A trip by 2 Mirai officers to divide tobacco leaf in the fall of 1898 provided Duke with an opportunity to broach the subject of a joint venture. In anticipation of customs duties increases the following year, Mirai sent Mirai Masao and Matsubara Jue to the United States to purchase a huge volume of tobacco leaves. Before the two returned to Japan, Duke asked them to meet with him in New York. There he told them that, and I quote here, "Since we will eventually not be able to avoid severe competition with each other, how about moving now to join hands and work together? Pardon my frankness, but if we offer you the results of our long experience in the US and our technology and provide capital for developing a large-scale tobacco business in Japan, there will definitely be good profits made." Duke's comment about competition carried with it the threat that American tobacco could effectively destroy Marai Brothers, either on its own or together with another Japanese cigarette maker. That threat was far from idle and became even more real in the spring of 1899, when Marai Brothers fell into severe financial straits. In anticipation of increased production costs due to the impending rise in customs duties, Marai Brothers had announced a price hike for one of its most popular brands, Hero. Retailers had responded by buying more cigarettes than they normally would have before the hike went into effect. In other words, they tried to shore up or stock up as much as they could at a lower price. To meet that increase in orders, Marai Brothers had expanded its production capabilities. Yet when the hike took effect, demand fell off, and Marai Brothers found itself with excess inventory. Compounding that pressure were looming due dates for interest payments on bank loans, plus payment for the huge volume of leaf tobacco that Marai Masao and Matsubara had purchased the previous fall. Marai Kichibei had been disinclined to negotiate with Duke about a joint venture, but found himself compelled to do so in the spring of summer of 1899, just in order to keep his company afloat. American tobacco had the upper hand in the negotiations, and the final deal reflected that. Duke initially invested 5 million yen, or about $2 million, which equaled the agreed upon value of all Marai holdings. When the newly formed Marai Brothers and Company Limited then sold stock, Duke spent an additional $3 million to acquire 60% of the shares. This second move effectively gave American Tobacco managerial control. While the posts of president, second vice president, third vice president, and general affairs manager were held by Japanese, and much management responsibility remained in local hands, Parrish, as first vice president, played a significant role in directing the company until the summer of 1904, when the Japanese government extended its monopoly on leaf tobacco to all tobacco products and forced the liquidation of private tobacco manufacturing firms. As such, Parrish was instrumental in ensuring that Duke made money on this venture. During his tenure as American Tobacco's man in Japan, Parrish dealt with a host of different issues, some unique to Marai Brothers and Company Limited, and some just part and parcel of being in the tobacco business at a time when competition was stiff, enforcement of copyright laws was at times lax and biased, reformers were experiencing success in banning smoking by minors, and the threat of more intrusive state control was ever looming. According to Parrish's business correspondence, typical days in the office saw him dealing with complaints about cigarettes packed in the wrong cartons, appeals from jobbers or retailers for refunds on inventory that had gone bad during Japan's humid summer months, orders for new advertising posters, and quality control of matches, which Marai included with some brands as a sales gimmick. Parrish also spent considerable time negotiating purchase or licensing fees for machines for manufacturing cigarettes, the use of which set Marai apart initially. While these machines enabled the company to mass produce, Parrish also had to address the stigma that lasted well into the 20th century that man-made cigarettes were not as good as hand-rolled ones. Imitators posed additional challenges. Among the earliest copiers was Kimura Shoten, an established importer of tobacco leaves, which ventured into the cigarette-making business in 1898. In an effort to get a leg up, Kimura attempted to piggyback off the success of Marai's Hero brand by naming one of its first cigarettes Hollow. Because the letter L is pronounced like an R in Japanese, Kimura's Haro bore a striking resemblance to Marai's Hero. In May 1900, Parrish responded to this infringement by requesting that the Mirai brothers' Japanese lawyer publish in leading Tokyo and Osaka newspapers an announcement to the effect that the hero name and image of a rising sun crossed by 2 cigarettes had been duly registered, and that, and I quote here, all imitators infringing upon our rights will be prosecuted. While Parrish subsequently expressed disinterest in suing Kimura in a private letter to an American tobacco executive in New York, Kimura Noboru's insistence, as the founder of Kimura Shoten, his insistence that he was, to quote, morally guilty, but not legally guilty, and his refusal to desist with production forced Parrish's hand. In June 1900, Mirai Brothers filed suit in a Tokyo court, charging Kimura of copyright infringement. The 2 sides ended up settling out of court. What the agreement stipulated is unclear, but Mirai Brothers and Company Limited clearly prevailed when it acquired Kimura Shoten less than 6 months later. And, interestingly enough, began to produce hollow cigarettes in addition to hero cigarettes. The most persistent challenge Parrish faced was the allegation that Mirai Brothers was unpatriotic. Given that Duke's investment in the joint venture represented the largest by any foreign company in late Meiji Japan, this charge was not surprising. The viciousness of the public attacks by rival cigarette manufacturers did shock nonetheless. Iwaya Matsuhei was at the forefront in publishing scathing editorials and nationalistic advertisements in a number of different newspapers in the late 1890s and early 1900s. His tamer pieces stressed his own patriotism in supposed juxtaposition to Mirai Kichibei's lack of the same. And they often touted the fact that Iwaya's business contributed substantially to Japan's national interests by paying 2 million yen a year in taxes. The more strident articles took direct aim at Mirai and accused him of permitting his foreign backers to drain revenue out of Japan. James Duke did not escape without a tongue lashing, being labeled, I quote, a capitalist who was intending to monopolize the whole world. In the face of such charges, Parrish could do little to defend Mirai Brothers. The most egregious of attacks were rebutted in print as being distortions of the truth, if not outright lies. Otherwise, Parrish made a concerted effort to avoid the trap of doing business with foreigners. Case in point, he departed from conventional expatriate wisdom and engaged only Japanese banks to handle company financial transactions. Beyond that, he went about the business of trying to maintain for Mirai Brothers and Company Limited a reputation for making good products, and he worked to sell as many cigarettes as he could. Parrish's sales plan depended upon extensive and aggressive advertising, and in this he continued the practice of Mirai Brothers from its organization in 1894. That practice, in turn, had borrowed much from Duke's own flashy advertising gimmicks. For example, when Mirai Brothers began marketing its hero brand, the same year as its founding, it organized parades through downtown Tokyo, complete with a band, large banners, and horse-drawn carts. The following year, the company displayed its brands at the 4th Domestic Industrial Exposition in Kyoto and erected billboards outside of the fairgrounds to draw attention to the same. And in 1897, to win converts to its new Virgin cigarettes, you gotta love some of the names of these cigarette brands, Mirai Brothers entered all buyers into a raffle for bicycles and gold and silver pocket watches, among other high-end products. Advertising under Parrish's tenure reached new heights and degrees of sophistication, in part because competition required bigger and flashier promotion to attract smokers, and in part because the initial 10 million yen capitalization of Mirai Brothers and Company Limited provided adequate funds for such expenditures. Parades with bands, I forgot a little picture. Parades with bands and banners in urban centers remained a practice, as this image of a promotional push for Pinhead cigarettes shows. I apologize that some of these photos are not better. These are scans from black and white images from the Rubinstein Rare Book and Manuscript Archive at Duke. To this, Parrish added advertising specifically aimed at travelers on Japan's rapidly expanding railroads. Signs were designed and distributed for distribution in railroad stations around the country. In addition, as this image shows, Parrish hired workers to wave banners touting Mirai brands to passing trains. Now, I don't know if you can see way up in the background, those large white letters, actually in reality they are large, they spell out pinhead, sort of the Japanese katakana spelling for pinhead, which is also then the spelling pinhead on these banners. This is a takeoff of the making of a huge character for the letter large that is always put every year in the summer on a mountainside overlooking Kyoto and then is set on fire for a summer festival or matsuri. This is a great way then to advertise for cheap, and at a distance, a new tobacco brand. Parrish also took great advantage of the 5th National Industrial Exposition held in Osaka in 1903. In addition to exhibiting Mirai products in the agricultural building, this is the, again, not a great picture, but rather flashy kind of display case for Mirai products, again in the agricultural building, which is where all tobacco products were displayed. Parrish also set up a smoking stand near the Formosan building, where sales girls, certainly attractive, wearing aprons decorated with old gold labels, tried to entice passers-by to buy a pack and light up. The piece de resistance, however, there we go, was this 125-foot old gold tower, adorned conspicuously, or at least in person, you can see, with the Mirai name. This edifice more than dwarfed all of the other tobacco firms present at the Osaka Exposition. One of those other tobacco firms, Iwaya, the great attacker of Mirai's patriotism, was just down the way. Now, while this tobacco tower alone did not prompt the Japanese government to extend its monopoly to all tobacco manufacturing the next year in 1904, the in-your-face kind of advertising in which Parrish engaged did not win Mirai Brothers many friends in government, nor did the substantial profits that the company had made since American Tobacco's investment. In 1900, Mirai Brothers enjoyed profits to the tune of just over 770,000 yen as profits. The total for 1901 was nearly double that 1900 figure, while in 1902 the company made just shy of 1.7 million yen, again in profits. Of that amount from 1902, American Tobacco's take was $500,000. For a country on the cusp of going to war with Russia, it was anathema for that amount of money made in Japan by Japanese workers not to be available for the betterment of the nation and the expansion of the empire. To say that Parrish's efforts on behalf of American tobacco served as one catalyst for the government's decision to nationalize the entire tobacco industry would then not be an overstatement. This fact was not entirely lost on Parrish himself, and he was among the first to admit that the end of private tobacco businesses was imminent. Indeed, he counseled American tobacco executives in the United States that any effort to fight nationalization would only further engender animosity towards Mirai Brothers and Company Limited. He added that his best course of action would be to try to negotiate the best liquidation terms that he could. In the end, Parrish did a commendable job, with the help of some American and diplomatic pressure. That pressure then again not against nationalization, but rather against the various proposals that the Japanese government put forth for liquidation. At the time of liquidation, all Mirai Brothers assets, including buildings, machines, inventory, and trademarks, together with a publishing company that Mirai had established several years before to produce its own advertising materials and packaging. All of those assets were valued at around 12 million yen. The government offered shareholders all but about 700,000 yen, or roughly $350,000, which equaled then 73% of that amount was to be paid in cash, and the remainder in bonds. Given that Parrish and Mirai had at one point expected to be, and I quote here, skinned alive in the liquidation process. This payout, equal to 94% of the company's value, not its projected value, not including goodwill, but rather its value at that particular point in time, getting 94% of the company's value, showed noteworthy generosity on the part of the Japanese government. Parrish's efforts on behalf of American Tobacco and Marai Brothers did not go unnoticed, nor did his contributions to the development of the Japanese tobacco industry. James Duke offered him plum assignments in New York and overseas, all of which Parrish declined. Marai Kichibei feted Parrish and his family. At a formal dinner at Marai's residence in Tokyo, the company had since moved its headquarters. In the early 1900s, the company moved its headquarters from Kyoto to Tokyo in order to kind of be in the midst of the tobacco fight. Tokyo was where these other two major competitors were located themselves. Again, Marai feted Parrish and his family to a very elaborate formal dinner in Tokyo prior to Parrish's return to the United States. Parrish also, or rather Marai, also on behalf of the family, gave Parrish $5,000 for his service. Even the emperor recognized Parrish, bestowing on him the Third Order of the Sacred Treasure as an expression of, and I quote here, the transcript of the text that went with this star-shaped medal award, as an expression of friendship. Parrish had indeed been a friend to Japan. His work at Marai Brothers had helped his company to modernize with respect to its manufacturing processes and advertising, and that example prompted other major cigarette manufacturers, including the state from 1904, to follow suit. Those profits that stayed in Japan and the increasing taxes that Marai Brothers paid as a result of business success similarly contributed to economic growth and provided the state with more revenue. That very success, however, challenged Japanese nationalism. And however friendly Parrish was, his identity as an American and Marai Brothers' links to American tobacco meant that this joint venture would be a short-lived experiment in the late Meiji period. Thank you. That is what I have there. Any questions? Points of clarification?
There's some time for questions and comments.
Could you talk a little bit about what the place of this episode is in the larger project?
In the larger project?
Yeah, I have a bunch of little questions, but I don't have to. But it seems like it could be just very suggestive. I think it's really interesting. If I understood what you're saying correctly, it's kind of this brief moment of privatization between two periods of sort of clamping down, nationalization, regulation, and that seems fascinating to me. Like, why do they do that? What do they have in mind? What does that say about maybe Japan being at a crossroads at this moment where they decided to open up a little bit and then they decided not to? So, to me, that was a really fascinating element of this. And I just wondered if you could talk about the larger project a little more and how it speaks to this kind of moment of openness.
One thing that maybe then I gave a misimpression of, I see openness as not sort of different phases, but rather there was a private cigarette manufacturing industry that existed in Japan up until 1904, and then the government cracked down. So it's, in a sense, it's a before-after.
Okay.
But
before the Americans come in,
it was all private.
Right, but is it more tightly regulated? I mean, no, okay.
No. I mean, to what extent it was actually regulated, I haven't been able to find information. And some of that has to do with the fact that what information is available in Japanese basically includes then newspaper articles and advertisements, and then government surveys that are statistical surveys, as well as laws of different government actions. But up until 1904, the cigarette industry was entirely private industry. The government was not involved. And the state itself, in a piecemeal fashion that I described today, went about inserting itself into the tobacco industry. So I think one of the things that points to is a maturation in the state itself, and a greater understanding on the part of Meiji aristocrats, not Meiji aristocrats, but Meiji oligarchs, about the ways in which they could use industry ways in which they could use agricultural products to the betterment of the state or the betterment, to provide funds for nation-building projects and then imperial expansion. Where it fits into the larger project, frankly, that's something that I'm still trying to grapple with. I have a basic chapter outlined for the book. I see the development of the state monopoly as one of those chapters. And some of the questions that I will then try to tease out in that particular chapter, and I got to a little bit today, are most importantly, why did the state feel so compelled to take an industry that, with fairly minimal regulation, was thriving, and not just thriving, but actually, increasingly growing year after year after year, and this was a transition for the Japanese in their smoking habits away from the long-stemmed small bowl pipes of the Tokugawa period to a more modernized notion of what it meant to be smoking, and that involved then cigarettes. So again, why did the state feel so compelled to then take that final step and fully nationalize the industry? And what I didn't talk about too much today, and I only referred to, was the Russo-Japanese War as well. Because that wasn't just the desire to nationalize and reap, to the extent possible, financial benefits of the tobacco industry that came about through nationalization, but you had then the Russo-Japanese War being Japan's great entree onto the international stage. Japan beat a Caucasian power. It finally emerged as an equal of the Western powers. And nationalization went hand in hand, I think, also with that surge in Japanese nationalism. So I'm not sure if that really answers some of your question about the larger context.
Yeah, no, and just thank you for clarifying. I had a misimpression of what it was like before the Americans came in.
Yeah, it was sort of piecemeal.
Yeah.
Through the last decades of the 19th century until 1904. Yes.
I'm rather curious to see when I think about the smoking in general today and the smoking industry as such.
Yes.
One thing that strikes me from my own reading has been that in much of Asia, it's still a very big thing. We're exporting a lot of our cigarettes still today to Asia, and part of me thinks about how cultures do what they do, and how we know what we know about what cigarettes do today. But it still strikes me that throughout Asia, it's still a very big thing, my understanding. Is that correct? And that being, why does that persist till this day?
I think some of it has to do with machoism. It is, smoking in Japan is very much still a part of men's culture. I think you also have, in the case of Japan, a much slower uptake on the part of the government and the medical industry to publicize the effects of smoking. Even within the last 10 years, well, I should say within the last 10 to 15 years, there have been a range of different rules and regulations passed in Japan to ban smoking in certain places, to require that Shinkansen, the express trains, no longer allow smoking in every single car. You have designated smoking cars. There are special areas on train platforms that are boxed in, that are smoking areas. So there's an acknowledgement to some extent within the last 10, 15 years that smoking is detrimental to the health, but the regulations are by no means as strident as they are in the United States. When I went on my email today, I noticed a headline for Wayne Today was the university's policy, which I gather will be implemented then in August of this year, to ban smoking across campus, not just within 200 feet or yards, whatever it is, of buildings. So even here in the United States, we're slowly coming to it. In Japan, much slower. And again, I think some of it has to do with the machoism of the culture. I also think it has to do with the fact that the government still makes a ton of money off the tobacco industry and is in cahoots, okay, this is some of my paranoia coming out, is in cahoots in some ways with the medical industry to try to maintain various kinds of practices that are beneficial to the state. That also involves a short-sightedness, clearly, about the long-term medical consequences of continued smoking. But you don't see the kinds of advertisements and campaigns that you do in the United States about the health consequences of smoking. You also had, going back to the Meiji period, smoking was something that it didn't matter one's class, it didn't matter one's gender, it didn't matter one's age. smoking was seen as then just a custom. It was a way in which Japanese socialized with each other. The same kinds of accoutrements that are used for the tea ceremony, kind of the tray and the little hibachi. You can also easily modify those to basically have your tobacco bowl or your tobacco tray. So a variety of different kinds of, I think, factors why smoking is still as prevalent as in Japan as it is today. Yes?
Well, I had a thought, but before that, just what you said raises a question. To what extent was smoking in the Meiji period seen as an act of internationalization? That the act of smoking was an act of opening up to the West, and to what extent were tobacco and cigarettes just seen as a Japanese product that indeed American tobacco was horning in on native markets?
In the I'm trying to think, so tobacco or cigarettes themselves really only took off in the 1890s, in the very early part of the 20th century. And that was a time when Japan had already moved beyond this wave of massive westernization, which was equated in the 1870s with modernization. That said, even after a more conservative streak took place or came into play in Japan in the 1880s, cigarettes continued to carry with them this whiff of modernization or whiff of westernization and equality with the West, and that was one of their big selling points. And Mirai, and I don't know if can't really see from this one picture, actually the sailor, and I don't have other images, but one of the things that Mirai definitely did with his advertising, and this was even more pronounced, I think, after the American tobacco investment, was to use Western images and to play up kind of this image of Mirai, not just as a company that was using imported tobacco leaves from Virginia, North Carolina, but Mirai also made its name by flavoring the tobacco, which was something that was done by American Tobacco itself, selling not just Mirai brands, but American tobacco brands. It staked its claim very much on being Western and more international. Iwaya took a different tack on that, but you're right, cigarettes were very much helped in the game by being associated with the West. But I would say around the time of the Russo-Japanese War, and certainly this is prompted in part by the nationalization of the tobacco industry, cigarettes became also associated with Japan proper. And I say this because first during the Sino-Japanese War and then again during the Russo-Japanese War, soldiers and sailors were provided with cigarettes to help relieve some of the battle tension. And sending those was considered to be a patriotic act. Smoking those was also then considered to be a patriotic act. So you had this transference, and that's actually something that I should look more at. At what point did smoking seem, or at what point did Japanese smokers consider the act of smoking a cigarette to be a nationalistic or patriotic act as opposed to something that made them more enlightened or civilized? One other thing that contributed, I should just mention, to the shift from smoking cigarettes, or from smoking with pipes to cigarettes, which smoking with pipes still remained very common into the 20th century, but one other thing that contributed to the turnover is the simple ease of lighting up. I mean, it wasn't this long process and it wasn't as elaborate smoking a cigarette as it was smoking then with the traditional pipe.
I have just a nit, by the way. This
Yes.
is a matter of no larger significance, but it's something to be aware of. I think the Hiro litigation couldn't possibly have been a copyright suit. It was a trademark suit.
Okay,
There are
so
lots of-
terminology part on my part. Okay.
Right, I mean-
Trademark as opposed to copyright?
Right. There may be a lot of sources out there written by people who don't know the difference between copyright and trademark, but it was a trademark suit.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate that correction. Yeah, clearly I, no, but thank you. Yes?
Yeah, your previous remark, you got me to thinking about, was there something about, or remaining today, of Japanese masculine culture itself? Is there, I mean, because even when I observe people smoking today, it seems to be more men than women. And I kind of wonder if there's a sort of a link between the sense of being manly smoking and, as your picture clearly seems to indicate here, too, how much of masculine culture and the Japanese sense of macho-ness contributed to that, or contributes still today, the sense of to be a man, to look cool, to be and the very name, hero, and as you say about being a soldier, and all these connotations of masculinity just seem to be a really strong image.
My sense is that the link between instance of Japanese masculinity and smoking is something that is there today, but does not necessarily apply back to the Meiji period. Again, women smoked during the Meiji period, and very commonly and very openly. I think in the post-war period, this link with masculinity also has grown up out of the salaryman culture, the white-collar workers' culture of men in the office 6 days a week, maybe on the golf course with colleagues and clients on weekends, out drinking until 11 or 12 at night, and then smoking is also part of that larger kind of business culture, which again is a very masculine culture, because employment structures and childcare structures and whatnot discourage women from being part of the business world in that same kind of way.
But that a woman smoking was a kind of act of defiance, it was a rebellious thing.
When?
Today or back then,
I would say back then it was not an act of defiance. There was no stigma against women smoking. And there are images of women smoking. The most noted case I have is the founder of the Japan Women's Christian Temperance Union, which targeted smoking and targeted drinking and all of these various vices. She herself smoked, and she smoked for 6 decades. And it was only after she converted to Christianity and heard the message of the World Women's Christian Temperance Union about the religious and nationalistic evils of smoking that she herself stopped. Well, she also almost burned down the school where she was a headmistress. So that may have played a role as well. But again, what information is available from the Meiji period suggests that smoking was not gender determined in a sense. So again, I come back to the post-war.
But it later became so as it evolved?
Yes. And some of why I'm thinking of that is more anecdotal than anything else. My husband and I lived in Tokyo for about 6 years before we moved here, and he worked for Citibank, but with a lot of Japanese colleagues. And the young Japanese men, not just the old Japanese men, but the young Japanese men also smoked almost everybody did, whereas the women he worked with, and I'm thinking the same thing the women I worked with when I taught English, the women didn't smoke, but the men did. So I expect there are various other things that are playing into that gender disparation in terms of smoking today. Not just masculine culture, not just the work environment, but that a little bit out of my realm of research. Any other questions? Things I can clarify? Thank you.